Okay. Oh, alrighty. Okay, so that is not working yet. All right, I see what I'm doing. Got to remember to switch things over. All right, there's my projector. Okay, so today we're gonna keep talking about what we were talking about last time, right? We started in talking about families. We got through kind of Rigneris's argument about kind of the shift in the way young people perceive marriage and its purpose, right? From a foundational model back when we were talking like our silence, maybe our baby boomers, and then to today with Gen Z, where we're talking about what he would call a capstone model. Sorry, my brain is, for some reason, not entirely engaged with this fine Monday. All right. So we're going to now kind of pivot into a couple of other arguments, talking about kind of families. So the first one has to do with status and trying to explain a couple of things. One, potentially why young people don't get married, and as much, right? They do eventually, some of them anyway, and why, young people, especially Gen Z, are choosing in large numbers not to have children, right? It's becoming a much more popular option to say that people want to remain child-free for their whole lives. So we're going to talk about that first, and then we're going to pivot into, in the last part, a fairly involved kind of look at some statistics on how family structure affects children, particularly life outcomes and things like that, right? From Melissa Kearney, who is an economist. If we have time, we'll see how it goes. Hopefully I'm not talking about this for 3 whole hours, minus the break. We might start talking a little bit about work. Work is a really short unit. And then, should have time on Wednesday for one other thing after that. And then like Monday is midterm too. Okay, midterms. Haven't started marking other things and recording lectures for one of my other classes. So I'm a little bit behind. I should have them done on Wednesday, I believe. So I should have your grades back to you by Wednesday for your first midterm, which gives us a couple days if you want to review before the next midterm. Okay. That's my preamble. How are you all? Can you believe it's almost the end of May? No? I was like, oh, it's May 26th. I'm like, oh, I get paid tomorrow. That's the nice thing. But yeah, I'm a little shocked that it's already the end of May. Okay, so shall we begin? So this is kind of where we stopped last time. Didn't quite get to this because we only had an hour and a half. We're going to talk about this piece by Johann Kurtz. Kurtz is a sort of independent analyst who does work in the UK and has been publishing stuff on Substack. And I ran across this argument. I thought it was so fascinating that I kind of want to present it because I think it's an interesting and kind of, like I said, I like people who look at things a little bit sideways, who aren't entirely orthodox in their kind of sociological views. And he presents an argument basically that I think offers a possible explanation, though I don't think it's definitive, of why people aren't having children and why potentially other things that go with children, like getting married, why those things too are less prioritized. And it all has to do with the pursuit of social status. But okay, let's set up some foundations here. Okay, so when we talk about fertility, right? And if you ever, if you've kind of followed popular discourses, you'll realize that questions about fertility, have kind of come into public attention recently. One of the people that's been talking a lot about it is Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk, I don't know, maybe Elon's trying to justify why he has like 12 children by a number of different mothers. I don't know. If you ever end up as an executive assistant to Elon Musk and you're female, it seems like you almost always end up getting pregnant with his child, which is a little distressing. Maybe there's something untowards there. But this kind of question of fertility is something that demographers have been commenting on for a long time. Just nobody really seems to care. All right, what is, I think, unavoidable is outside of a few enclaves, right? A few places on Earth. Fertility globally is in a relatively rapid state of collapse. And we say collapse, right? I know I've given you this number before. Replacement fertility is 2.1 children per woman, in the fertile range, right? So roughly 15 to 44 years old. How many children do we expect women to have in that period, right? So replacement fertility is 2.1 children per woman. Globally, the number of children per woman is declining, right? And these are just these Sustainable Development Goal estimates from the United Nations, right? In 1990, 1995, global fertility was about 3 children per woman. 2010 to 2015, it had dropped just above replacement, right? 2.5 children per woman. And by middle of the century, it'll it'd be about 2.2. By the end of the 21st century, what century am I in? The 21st, it'll have dropped globally below replacement. Now, these are kind of estimates. There's mounting evidence that I think this is going to happen a lot quicker than we might think. Most countries in the developed world, right, have long fallen below replacement fertility. Even countries that were relative stragglers, like France and the United States, have now fallen, somewhat below. I think the U.S. Today is sitting at about 1.6. I can't remember what France's total fertility rate is. So 1.6. 1.6 children per woman. Okay, so and we're starting to see, places in the developing world kind of falling in this range as well, right? Where their total fertility is declining also. And we really see what Kurtz suggests, and I think this is correct, is that we lack a really cohesive thesis for why this is happening. And the things that people almost always turn to as kind of quick answers for this is things like economics, housing, declines in religiosity, the availability of contraception, and the availability of childcare and the cost of childcare, right? But what Kurt suggests is none of this actually fits for a bunch of reasons. We'll go through them really quickly. Okay, so economics. You'll probably hear this in the popular press, right? You'll hear this, if you kind of listen to discourses even in Canada. You can go to like the Globe and Mail, and you can go to the National Post and other kind of commentary outlets. And one of the things you'll often hear as to why Canada's fertility is declining is because, it's too expensive for young people to consider having children. Now, if that, and that other place is the same thing, right? People are too poor, children cost too much to have, right? Children are an economic burden. Now, if this was the case, what we would expect was that if governments offered some kind of economic interventions, you would be able to raise the total fertility rate, right? People would have more children based on available economic interventions. And now, okay, can I give you some like random trivia? This has been a problem for a really, really long time. If we go back to like, the year 0, AD, the Roman Empire had a similar problem, right, of really low fertility amongst Roman citizens. And the Roman Empire tried all sorts of economic incentives, including something that historians jokingly call, the land for babies initiatives of the Roman Empire under Augustus. Basically, for families that had 3 or more children, they would give them additional land, right? Because land was essentially the basic source of wealth. Farmland was the basic source of wealth in the Roman Empire. And what happened was that the Land for Babies initiative of the Roman Empire failed spectacularly. And this is essentially, the story of every economic attempt to increase fertility. And there's some really modern ones that are kind of fun and interesting. So, for example, the Russian Federation, right? So Russia has long had a declining population, like really since the 1980s, but really picking up in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Russian government has tried all sorts of initiatives to increase fertility, which included things like, mothers of new children would be given things like a car or a refrigerator. That doesn't seem like a good compensation for having a child to me, but for some reason in the 90s, the Russian government thought, you know what, I bet you women are lacking is a refrigerator. That's why they're not having babies. So it's like, have a baby, get a fridge. That didn't work. They've also tried like cash payments for children. So you get $60,000, whatever the equivalent in rubles is. That hasn't, what tends to happen is you get a sort of temporary spike, where some people take advantage of it who are maybe thinking about having children already, and then it sort of returns to its baseline or its kind of declining levels. Now, probably the most concerted effort to raise fertility has been in Hungary under the government of the current, is he the prime minister or president? I want to say prime minister, Viktor Orban. And Orban's government, right, being a kind of Hungarian nationalist government, has a whole bunch of focuses. But, one is, they want to keep out migrants because they want to keep a kind of pure Hungarian identity. It's a very small country with a very kind of unique culture and language. So the other thing, but they've had long declining fertility, right? One of the lowest fertility rates in Europe. And so Hungary, basically following this sociological logic that, it must be because children cost so much that it's difficult to get people to have children, that, they've basically, for a decade now, been giving lavish benefits to women in particular, but families in general, in order to try and get them to have more children. This has included, cash bonuses for every child after your second child. So if you have 3 kids or more, and most recently they announced, tax breaks. So basically for women, if you have 3 children in Hungary, you will never pay income tax again, right? You are exempt from income tax in an attempt to get women to have at least 3 children, right? Or at least some women to have at least 3 children. So Hungary today spends about 5% of its GDP on its fertility drive, which is a huge percentage, right? This is, I'm trying to think of what an equivalent of 5% of GDP in Canada is, but it's a huge amount. This is like what Donald Trump is asking NATO countries to spend on their militaries, right? 5% of GDP. It's a huge amount of money. And it is slowly driving Hungary into, economic oblivion, right? There's mounting debt in Hungary as they basically borrow cash internationally, largely to fund these social programs to try and raise their fertility. And it has not worked, right? The fertility rate remains stubbornly below replacement and considerably below. It's not even close at 1.59. Which isn't a complete disaster, right? But it does mean that, Hungary's population is going to continue to decline. There's going to be less Hungarians around. Okay. Other places that offer really generous benefits, right? Like parental leave. in Sweden and places like Sweden, Norway, Finland offer super generous parental leaves, sometimes 2 years of fully paid parental leave that can be taken by either parent, lavish social benefits, really cheap childcare, a lot of social costs covered by the state. And they continue, so children shouldn't be a huge economic burden in places like Sweden and Norway, but they continue to have some of the lowest fertility on Earth. And again, I think it kind of goes back to this quote from, see if I can find it, from Jonathan Haidt that I had, that I had at the beginning, right? The societies we have are some of the least efficient at turning resources, of which they have a lot, into offspring, of which they have few. And that's sort of where we are. Sorry, I'm jumping around. I just want to make it really, really hard for you to take notes by just jumping back and forth. Okay, so economics. So economics may play a role, right? And some economists have suggested that there are some policies that are going to work a little bit better than others at raising fertility. Specifically, one-time cash payments don't seem to work. Those don't seem to work particularly well. Ongoing transfers, right, where every month, and this is what Poland has done, every month, parents will receive a family kind of, what you would call kind of a family allowance, right? The government will pay you every month, in order to help support your children until your children turn like 16 or 17. And this seems to be slightly better. Poland's fertility is still below replacement, but it has, as they've increased these benefits, it has balanced out a little bit. Okay. So another explanation has been, around religiosity. And the explanation here is that as people get more or less religious, right, as, basically secularization, right, a decline in religiosity will equal lower fertility. That essentially, religious people have more children because they see it as a sort of religious duty, right? Be fruitful and multiply, taken quite literally. And so what you should see is, more religious societies having higher fertility, less religious societies having lower fertility, and if you could somehow increase religiosity, you would increase fertility. However, that again kind of goes against the available evidence, because outside of a few enclaves, right? So if we talk about the Amish, like super traditional Catholics, and I guess you could probably throw in Mormons. I should have put Mormons. You should always put Mormons. Outside of like a few groups, even the most religious people barely hit replacement, right? So if we think of like evangelicals, you know what evangelicals are, right? They're Protestants who are weekly attenders, right? They go to church every week. Their average fertility is something like 2.12, right? Just barely over replacement fertility. So if religiosity played a big role, we probably would see a greater kind of, many more evangelicals being born. And if we look at the three most religious countries in Europe, Romania, Moldova, and Greece, they all have negative population growth. You could throw Poland in there as well. Poland is very religious. And again, Poland has negative population growth also. Despite there being, Poland being a Roman Catholic country, I think it's 40% of Poles say they attend weekly. And the Catholic Church officially bans contraception. So you would think that people would have lots of children, but that's not the case in Poland either. Okay. Housing. I love this building. I don't know why. It reminds me of Windows 8. I don't know why. I feel like this is what Windows 8 would look like if it was a building. And I had a weird soft spot for Windows 8 in my heart. That's a very dated reference now. Okay. Most of you were probably in elementary school when Windows 8 came out. Okay, so even So here, I think this is probably Kurtz's weakest argument, housing. But what he suggests is, millennials. If we think that millennials were putting off having children because they couldn't afford homes, by 2022, half of millennials owned homes, but their childlessness rate had not declined, right? So if it's just housing and housing availability, you would think that the childlessness rate would be different. Now, the other thing that I would suggest is if you look at the macroeconomic data, you would think that places where housing is cheaper, like if you took, say, the snapshot of a country like Canada, you would think that where housing is cheaper and more available, you would see, if housing was the ultimate kind of cause of low fertility, you would see more people having children. But if you look across Canada, right, there's variations in the kind of fertility rate across Canada, but really expensive places like Ontario don't have markedly lower fertility rates than relatively cheap housing places like Saskatchewan and Alberta, right? So Alberta has a slightly higher fertility rate, but Alberta is also slightly younger. So you have more people, who are young and in childbearing years in Alberta. So the housing argument, I think this is the weakest one from Kurtz, but I do think there's something to saying that housing probably doesn't dictate everything. Okay, and this one, birth control. Because my title on this slide doesn't really tell you anything. Okay, so if we talk about the collapse in fertility in Western societies, the beginnings of that collapse actually start considerably before the availability of birth control. Okay, and like we talked about earlier in the course, you have this oddity, right? You can see it here. This is British data, but if you saw the American data, it's quite similar, right? You go back, you probably can't see the numbers there. This is 1800 here. This is the baby boom, right? But prior to the baby boom, fertility had been declining for a long time, despite the fact that contraception doesn't get invented until, hang on, let me put this in a different color, somewhere around here, right towards that tail end of the baby boom. So fertility had been declining for a long time. The baby boom is a kind of weird reversal of that, right? The silence, having a whole bunch of kids. But that is an oddity, and basically the reversal of a trend, that really starts somewhere around here, right around the end of, 1880, the end of the 19th century, you start to see fertility rates declining significantly, despite the fact that you had no medical means of doing so, right? Same thing for, England and Wales, right? You see it kind of peaks around here, kind of fertility peaks around there, kind of middle part, 1825, and then starts to decline and falls off well before you hit, the 20th century. And France, for whatever reason, probably owing to cultural differences and things like the French Revolution, France had its biggest decline in fertility kind of, prior to, kind of at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, right? And it never recovered. Like, you could say this is like your French Revolution, your Napoleonic Wars, but it never really recovers after that, and it continues to decline, after 1925. Okay, so what does Kurtz suggest, right? So he doesn't think any of what sociologists and demographers sort of traditionally consider the causes of people not having children to be particularly valid. So what does he think is the cause? And he thinks it's status. And right, if I won't flash back to the slide. The piece is called "It's Embarrassing to Be a Stay-at-Home Mom." We'll get to that in a sec, but that is an argument based on status. Now he says this manifests differently in different places as a proximate cause, right? As what could be causing declines in fertility. Okay, so what is status from a sociological perspective, right? Status is the perceived standing of the individual within a group, right? So it denotes your place both in formal and informal hierarchies. And we're all concerned with status, right? There's lots of research suggesting that, you're constantly sort of scanning your environment for social status. And we'll see a little bit later in the course, right? Jonathan Haidt makes this argument talking about why social media, and especially visual social media, is so detrimental to girls' kind of social image or their self-image. It's because they're judging their status compared to, the impossibly beautiful women that have been photoshopped that they see online. Okay, so gaining status is a motivation for each individual to participate in society productively, right? We all want to move up status hierarchies. We want to maximize our status in our kind of environment. And how do we gain status? Well, we gain it and maintain it through approved behaviors, achievements, etiquette, defending the group, right? Through possessions of recognized status symbols, things like titles, wealth, important physical assets, degrees, all of these sorts of things, right? So that's how you get status, right? Achievements, etiquette, defending the group, titles, wealth, important physical assets. All right. What Kurt says is, especially for young people, the net status outcome. So if you took your status, right, the status of having a child is lower than what you would get from various competing undertakings, right? So things like pursuing a successful career in particular. So pursuing education, pursuing a successful career. And as a consequence, having children is deprioritized, right? So especially for young people, if you are pursuing status, right, you're going to pursue other things. Now, this all functions, for Kurtz, kind of unconsciously. You may not be aware of what you're doing, and you're picking up status markers and, your understanding of how to gain status from the environment around you. So your peers, make certain status claims, and you kind of pick up on those. And so what happens when, the net status outcome of having a child is lower than other things you can do? You deprioritize it so people have fewer children, and certainly they're going to push it off later and later. Okay. Just want to check if there's any questions. And he makes this claim, right? So things we can test. If you want to test his hypothesis, right, what would you do, right? You've got a bunch of hypotheses. So interventions which increase the status of parents would increase fertility. We can call this H1, hypothesis 1. Communities in which parents are of higher status have higher fertility. We can call this H2. High status individuals who become parents cause others to follow. We can call this H3. Social strivers, right? People striving to move up the social hierarchy, forego having children for higher status objectives. We can call that H4. Status secure people, so established elites, you're rich, are going to have higher fertility. We can call that H5 or hypothesis 5. And groups with unusual status systems will have unusual fertility patterns. We can call that H6. Okay, so let's take them in turn. So status and fertility, right? So we're going to check this. Interventions which increase the status of parents will increase fertility. So we're going to look at a couple of weird cases, right? So we're going to call it, these are H1. So we're going to look at Georgia. And by this, I mean Georgia, the small nation in the Caucasus, not Georgia, the state where they grow peaches, right? So the country of Georgia. So Georgia is a really weird kind of place, right? Really small country, long dominated by either the Russian or Soviet empires. It's about do I have the population on here? It's about 5 million people in Georgia. So it's quite a small country. And something happens that's kind of weird. So following the collapse of the Soviet Union, like most of the former Soviet republics, fertility in Georgia takes a nosedive, right? And Georgia, because it's a small country, if people don't have children, that kind of unique culture is at risk of disappearing, right? Within a couple of 5-6 generations, those kinds of countries are at great risk. However, what happens in the mid-2000s is Georgia sees a spike in its fertility rate. It increases by about 28%. And it reached replacement level fertility. Now, it's subsequently come down just below replacement. I think fertility in Georgia today, the TFR, is somewhere like 2.08. So it's just slightly shy of that 2.1, but it's still pretty close. So it reached replacement fertility. And what happened, the cause, what everybody thinks is the cause of this is that this guy, so his name is Ilya the second, right? He is, he's, because Georgia is a Christian Orthodox country, an Eastern Orthodox country. So this country has what's called a patriarch, right? So he's sort of the head of the Georgian Orthodox Church. And what Ilya said was that he would baptize and become the godfather to all third children and onward. So if you had 3 children, Ilya would baptize them personally, right? He'd come to your church and baptize your child and become their godfather. And what happened? Births of third children boomed, right? Now, what Kurt says very carefully here is that it's not like everybody had 3 children. You still saw lots of people having, lots of women having 0, 1, and 2 children, but the number of women having 3 children or more was enough that it basically offset all of these, right? And it doesn't have to be a huge percentage of people having, 3 or more children to sort of offset, some of these, as long as more people are here than here. If it's 3 and 0, that's a bigger problem. But something around 20% of Georgian women started having 3 or more children. Now, this has been widely understood in the kind of sociological literature as a religious phenomenon, right? Because, he's got a big cross on his head. This was seen as, Georgians responding to something that a religious figure did. And it's kind of true, but what Kurtz suggests, and I think this is a really interesting argument, which is why I'm telling you about it, he suggests that it's actually a status phenomenon, right? Because in Georgia, Ilya is a celebrity, right? He's the head of one of the most important institutions in the country. And so if he's the godfather for your kid, it's kind of like you are, you're the godfather for your child is like Ed Sheeran or something, right? I don't know if Ed Sheeran is still cool. Taylor Swift, maybe not quite Taylor Swift levels. She's more of a global celebrity. Let's say Connor McDavid. We'll go with a local example. In Edmonton, imagine this. If the the city council of Edmonton announced that every third child and onward that a person had, their godparent would be Connor McDavid, and he would show up, at your house or at your church or whatever, and then you could take pictures with them and he would hold your baby and all this kind of stuff. Probably, there's some percentage of people that just to be in the same room as Connor McDavid would, have a third child, right? People also emulate celebrities, right? And this is something else that he talks about. If celebrities start having a lot of children, especially super popular ones, you can see a sort of celebrity effect. So Georgia's TFR goes up. He thinks it's a status effect, right? You raise your status by affiliating yourself with Ilya, right? If he's the godfather of your child, right, and he's the one personally who does the baptism, that is like a big plus for your social status. You're now connected to one of the most important people in your society. Okay. Just want to see if there's any questions. No questions. Good. Okay. Another one that's really, really weird. So, Mongolia. Mongolia is a very odd place. right? So it is a country kind of squished between Russian Siberia and China, right? So Siberia is here, right? And all of this stuff, that you see colored, that's all China. So Mongolia is kind of landlocked. It's a weird country. It's relatively isolated. It has one of the lowest English-speaking populations in the world. Like almost no one in Mongolia speaks English. They also use a kind of variant of the Russian alphabet. It's Cyrillic. So they're a really kind of unique place. Now, the same kind of thing happened to Mongolia in the post-Soviet period because it was aligned with the Soviet Union, obviously because of where it is, not a whole lot of choice. It was a communist country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the breakdown of communism, Mongolia's fertility kind of takes a big dip. But, they reversed that about 20 years ago, and Mongolian fertility has been consistently 2 to 3 times higher than that of its neighbors, basically for that 20-year period. And you see here, right, Mongolia's kind of TFR significantly above replacement at 2.64. And I mean, if you took where's South Korea? This is an old number for South Korea. That's 1.37. Today, South Korea's total fertility rate is actually 0.68. So, fun times. Taiwan, 1.12. I don't know if I have Hong Kong, 1.23. The Japanese one got cut off on this picture, but it's quite low, right? It's based on the numbers, it's about 1.4. So really, really, really low. So and Russia's is low as well, right? If you went north, Russia's is very low as well. So what happened, right? Well, Mongolians make about as much. Their GDP per capita is about the same as Siberians and people in China, right? It's somewhere in and around between 10 and 17,000 US dollars per year GDP per capita. So not particularly high, but not particularly poor either. It's highly urbanized, right? It's, most of the population, about 70%, live in Mongolia's big urban industrial centers. It's not especially religious, right? It's primarily Buddhist and non-religious. But Buddhism isn't known for particularly stressing having children. But what people have pointed to, which makes Mongolia kind of odd, is this. The president of Mongolia gives an award, which I love the name, the Order of Maternal Glory. Right? I don't know how that translates in Mongolian, but to each mother of 4 children or more. And as a financial incentive, they also get $60, right? Now what happens? I don't think I have a picture of it. No. The president of Mongolia travels around the country every year to kind of large and smaller centers, and each one of them has a sort of town hall. Most of those town halls have a statue of Genghis Khan outside of them, because that's Mongolia's continued claim to fame, is that Genghis Khan came from Mongolia. So apparently there's lots of Genghis Khan statues all over Mongolia. I guess if you want to get fertility up, I think they say something like 30% of people in the world have some DNA from Genghis Khan, because he had so many children by so many women. So anyone in Eurasia, almost inevitably has some Genghis Khan's DNA. Okay, so anyway, he comes down and they do a big award ceremony for mothers of 4 children or more. They get a medal and a $60 cash payment. But again, you're getting it's kind of like the Order of Canada. You're getting an award from the government that recognizes some kind of important achievement. So again, it's a status thing, right? It increases status, and it's worked, right? Mongolia has relatively high fertility. So they're I think if we go back to our hypotheses, we could probably say, a tentative, that seems to be, hypothesis 1 seems to be borne out by those 2 case studies. Okay. So the opposite, right? And again, maybe if I go, I should have, my H2, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you a seizure here. Kind of, I guess testing number 3 in a sense. Whoops, what's this question? Have they looked at how children were treated, parented, especially 3rd and 4th children, supposedly born as social status symbols? I don't have that information. I don't know that much about Mongolian parenting techniques. I'm sort of on the macro level, but I will see if I can find anything about that. I have one of our grad students is Mongolian. I should ask her. I see on her desk, she has a picture of her very large Mongolian family. So, presumably her mother was given the Order of Maternal Glory. I should ask her. That'll be fun. I have a question. Was your mother awarded the Order of Maternal Glory? Okay, so the opposite, right? So if you think about the opposite, in South Korea, right? And again, South Korea, we're talking about what, 0.68 TFR, right? This is a disaster for a society, especially one like South Korea that has very low immigration. It sort of means that within about a century, your population is going to half. And within like 150 to 200 years, your population will essentially be gone, if nothing changes. And I will say this, sociology, if current trends continue, there will be no South Koreans. Current trends never continue. There's always something that interrupts things and changes things. Okay, so many high status people in the US are also childless. Unless her and Travis get it together. Did they break up? Not yet? Okay. We'll see. I mean, she needs some new material, right? She's really stretch out the relationship so it can be really tragic and she can write some fantastic breakup songs. I don't think she does that as much anymore. I think that's more her country days. I don't really listen to Taylor Swift, but I'm not exactly the target audience. The target audience is former Canadian prime ministers. Sorry. It was a little funny that Justin Trudeau was trading Taylor Swift bracelets with teenage girls at a concert. I won't say why, but, I don't like Justin Trudeau. You can't tell. Okay, yeah, if we look at some of the European elites, right, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and former German Chancellor Olaf Scholz were both also childless. Lots of the kind of European elites are childless as well. Okay, so do social strivers have fewer children? And here, we can look at South Korea a little bit. And I'm sorry, this text is really small. I have a lot of stuff on here. So we know this, right? Demand for education at elite institutions is at an all-time high, right? Most people would probably kill, especially in the States and abroad, to have their kid go to Harvard or Yale or Princeton. I guess if you have to go somewhere, you can also go to Princeton or Brown. I'm still bitter. Okay. Or as my friends who went to the University of Toronto always tell me, the University of Toronto, the Harvard of Canada. Honestly, I think my friends who went to University of Toronto, especially the ones who got their PhDs there, are worse than the people I know who went to Harvard about telling you where they went to school. It's absolutely ridiculous. I have one friend, he's like, when I did my degree in biblical studies at the University of Toronto, I'm like, Sean, we've been friends for 10 years. I know where you went to school. You don't have to drop it into every conversation. So tell me more about when you went to the University of Toronto. Okay, so demand for education, right, at elite institutions, all-time high. And what Kurtz suggests is resource-limited parents would increasingly would rather have fewer children who are in secure positions in elite universities than children who aren't, right? That having a Harvard-educated child is better than having 3 children. 1 Harvard child better than 3, children who went to, I don't know, the University of Ohio. Okay. Or the University of Alberta. Not the Harvard of Canada, apparently. Maybe we're the Brown of Canada. I don't know. Let's not compare. Okay, having a child at an elite university confers more status benefits, and I think this is obvious, right? If you've ever met someone whose my dentist's kid was going to Harvard, and again, I got a lot of weird dental work. Like my wife had to get like 2 root canals. I wonder why. But dropped in all the time. Oh yes, my son who's at Harvard. Okay, so having a child at an elite university offers social benefits as well. So more so than just having a child, right? No one cares about your kid who's going to the U of A, apparently. All right, so let's talk about South Korea. You're all very special, by the way. I say this as someone who has 2 degrees from the U of A and 1 from the University of Calgary. So I don't get to drop in when I was doing my PhD at the University of Alberta, because no one cares. Okay. In South Korea, right? TFR, total fertility rate, as of 2023 of 0.68. So desperately low. The culture incentivizes people to take whatever measures necessary to ensure status, right? And South Korea, it's an Asian culture. It's a particular kind of Asian culture, and it's super status obsessed, right? Your social status really, really matters in South Korean society, to the point where failure to achieve, a certain social status has really detrimental effects. And I'll put it this way. I will hang on. Let me break this down, and I'll tell you how crazy it is. All right, so South Korean society is super stratified, and one of these stratifications is between really high status employers, which is a small number of large state-connected firms called, and I cannot pronounce this word, and I've been corrected by Korean students like 10 times, and I still can't remember how they're supposed to be pronounced. I think it's called K-balls. Which are these large horizontally integrated companies that make everything, right? And so you probably recognize at least 2 of them, right? Samsung and LG. You can buy a Samsung smartphone, a fridge, a stove, a microwave. They make a lot of things. LG makes a lot of stuff too. Bless you. They used to make phones. They don't anymore. But you could add a whole bunch of other firms, right? Most notably Hyundai, Kia, right? The big South Korean car firms. These are the prestigious places to work in South Korea. It's not that they're the only places to work, but if you don't work at one, you're down the social ladder, right? Getting, into K-balls is a status thing. And if you don't, you're down the status ladder. They only recruit from certain universities in South Korea, right? They're very particular about who gets in to work at these large South Korean firms. So, life as a student in South Korea is, I think you could probably call it nightmarish by Western standards. Certainly, if I think of my daughter, and I shouldn't compare her to South Korean children, but maybe I should actually. She comes home from her 7-hour school day or whatever it is, and she's like, I'm so burnt out, I just need to chill. If she was in South Korea, she would be up at 5 in the morning to do private tutoring, go to school, and then come home, and then go off to more private tutoring that lasts till about 11 o'clock at night, right? And that's this guy. 15 hours of study in one day, right? It's the reason why Korean students suicide. Okay, so parents in South Korea, right, basically have to invest a small fortune in their children because you have to pay for a whole bunch of private tutoring in hopes that your kid is going to do really well on this national exam that will let you get into one of the universities, that will let you get in and work at one of the K-balls. And this exam is crazy. People study for it for years. It's like everybody in South Korea is studying for the LSATs or MCATs. And like the country shuts down. They shut down like air travel on the day of this exam. And if you get a bad score, your future is determined not to be, one of these elite people. So what's happened in South Korea, right? Parents have a kind of a choice. They can sacrifice their status, right? So in terms of possessions, right? Things that they own, in order to pay for extensive tutoring for their kids, or they can choose to have few kids. So what do we find in South Korea? Most families are really, really small, right? One child is the norm, but increasingly we're seeing lots of people just forgoing having children altogether in South Korea because they'd rather focus on their status than that of their children, and it's so hard. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that happens in South Korea is around the date of this exam, the youth suicide rate spikes to one of the highest in the world for young people. It's really tragic, and it's a really, really, I think, awful system. Okay, I will leave that. Okay, so status secure people. This is one of our other hypotheses. I can't remember which one I numbered it as. All right, in America, ultra-rich families, those with an income over $1 million would be the ones that we can count as secure, and they are the only demographic with above replacement fertility, right? Their fertility, about 2.1 children per woman, for people that have an income over $1 million. Weirdly, when you go from 1 million to $500,000, right? Now, $500,000 is still an extraordinary amount of money. Please pay me $500,000 a year, but that fertility rate drops to about 1.85, right? So considerably below replacement fertility. It's still above the American average, which I think I said it was 1.8 or 1.6, 1.787. But it's lower than our, super established people, even though if you make $500,000 a year, you could clearly afford it. So there's probably a couple of things going on in terms of status. When you're up here, probably, and what Kurt suggests, it's quite possible that, you're so wealthy that if your wife is working, right, mostly male men that are earning over $1 million a year, if your wife is working, it's kind of a status negative, right? Because you should be rich enough that she doesn't have to work. So that could play a role, right, in increasing fertility, but you just don't, you have no, there's no financial incentive, and you're already at the top of the status pyramid, so you can kind of do whatever you want in terms of having children. Even at that, it's not like they're having 6 and 7 children, right? It's still only, average 2.15. Okay, I'm almost done this. Okay, so status types. What kind of status types do we have? Dominance, right? You can gain status by dominance, and here we're probably talking in the modern world, it's more financial. But in the past, it would have been war, and hunting. Well, probably war more in terms of dominance, right? You can coerce others by fear, right, to gain social status. Okay, there's also virtue. You have social status by being, conspicuously dutiful, obedient, and moralistic, right? By doing the right things. But the one that we're probably most interested when it comes to our society is success. You achieve certain outcomes that are socially prescribed as good. Okay, so if we look at, pre-Enlightenment, right, and pre-industrialization, status for women was derived from birth, social class, virtue, things like virginity, piety, and motherhood, and most often conferred, religiously by the church, the Roman Catholic Church. Status derived from virtue and kind of dominance games. These don't require a trade-off with fertility, since really, or they didn't, because Fertility was connected with motherhood, which was an automatic kind of win in the virtue portion, right? And women would have been less engaged in dominance games. The Enlightenment, Kurt said, shifted the focus to what he calls meritocracy, right? And since the Enlightenment, you don't get status from your social standing, right? Whether you're born to rich or poor people, that doesn't necessarily determine your social status. It's what you achieve in life, right? How wealthy you get. And if anything, the society rewards people from lower social classes that move aggressively up that social hierarchy, right? That success hierarchy. If you go from poor to rich, right, you're a rags to riches story, which is like our favorite type of story. So we shifted to meritocracy, which has, these kind of outputs. All right. What Kurt suggests is one of the big status questions that you get asked today is, when people are trying to ascertain your status in casual conversation, is what do you do? A good answer is to lead with an established career, right? I'll put it to you this way. Well, this will get in, when we talk about work, we'll talk about my horrifying work experiences. I remember, so one of my good friends got married in, I want to say 2010. I was invited to his wedding, and at that same wedding was like a girl that I had dated in high school, right? Because they're still friends. And I was working at the time at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and inevitably we got chatting and the conversation turned to, what do you do? And I sheepishly answered that I was working at a rental car company, while she was working at, I think, British Petroleum at the time, BP, a big oil company. And that was kind of a bad answer because Enterprise Rent-A-Car is kind of a shitty job. More on that later. That's a kind of status thing, right? What's my status? And I won't say that I, decided to go back and do a master's and a PhD after that day, but yeah, kind of. Was it because I didn't succeed in impressing one of my ex-girlfriends? Well, maybe. It's a status thing. What Kurt says is, I'm a mother, or especially, I'm a stay-at-home mom, is a bad status answer, right? Can confirm when people I know have stayed home with their kids and, been stay-at-home parents, it's not something that, people are like, oh, well, what are you going to do when your kids, right? What kind of job are you going to go back to? That's the kind of question. And so what he suggests is, especially for young people, right? For our young, you want status. Knowing that children equals bad for status, that incentivizes people to not have children, right? And this has had kind of knock-on effects. And here, I'll give you one last little bit on this, and I think, I'll explain that in a sec. One last little piece of trivia. Poll conducted in Canada by Cardis, October 2024, so really recent, said half of Canadian women said they were having, that they had, or they were planning to have fewer children than they wanted. And this seems to be largely driven, by status, right? You'd have to sacrifice something else in order to have kids. And that's like career advancement, possessions and all of that stuff. So, all right, there's a question. What do I mean by dominance games? When you talk about dominance games, right, is how do you establish dominance over other people, right? So if you're trying to establish status by coercion or fear, right? How do you do that, right? How do you intimidate other people? That's a dominance game, right? Do you, get into fights with them? Do you, start a war? Whatever it happens to be, right? That's, intimidate them in some way. Through how powerful you are to establish your status over them. That's a dominance game. Okay. Peek-oop. How are we doing for time? Oh, we've had an hour. Too early to break? Yes, too early to break. Let's talk a little bit about Kearney and her two-parent privilege. We'll go for a bit, and then we'll take a break. All right, this is a really interesting book. Kearney is an economist. PhD in economics, really, really smart. And again, I heard an interview with her on a podcast. I can't remember which one now. And immediately I was like super attracted to the ideas because I'm like, oh, this is a little bit sideways and very different than, say, what you would often hear out of a sociology department, right? And this one, how the decline in marriage has increased inequality and lowered social mobility and what we can do about it. And, Lawrence Summers praises the book, former advisor to President Bill Clinton, and a Harvard Kennedy School of Business scholar. So interesting book. It's really interesting. All right, let's. Okay, maybe I'll give you a little bit of preamble from how she sets up the book. One of the things that she kind of sets up in the book is that this is a question that's been really hard to ask for economists and sociologists. And the title of the book here is actually kind of on purpose. And what she wanted to call it, she said initially she wanted to call it the one-parent problem. And the publisher said, I'm going to put it in a different color, you absolutely cannot call this book the one-parent problem because you're stigmatizing single mothers, right? So she called it instead the two-parent privilege. And she said that the idea for this came at an economics conference where they were talking about kind of childhood outcomes, childhood poverty, and some of the problems that, children from lower socioeconomic strata have. And she got up and she asked a question, which was like, well, what does marriage have to do with any of this? And the room, she said, went dead, right? Something that nobody wants to talk about is the role of marriage in this equation. So she decided to talk about it. Now, she said some of her colleagues came to her afterwards and were like, well, okay, you're saying, because she, said the data's pretty clear, the children of married parents have a significant advantage, economically, socially, emotionally over the children of non-married parents. One of her peers came and said, well, my kids or I'm divorced from my ex-wife. Are you saying my kids are doomed? And what she said is, rich kids are probably going to be fine, right? This is an economist at a prominent American university. Equals probably okay. Because, you can buy your way out of social problems. If your kid's having problems, you can pay to send them to therapy, right? You can continue to support them financially in ways that the poor and the poor and working class probably can't. And again, this gets back to that claim that I think is really interesting from Regnerus, that this question of marriage is kind of a weird social justice question because as it's become a luxury good, it benefits some people more than others. Okay, let's break into this a little bit. Okay, so the claim of the book is that family structure perpetuates privilege and inequality, right? So it puts a spotlight on the following point. Okay, over the past 40 years, dramatic decline in the share of children living with married parents, okay? And that shift has largely happened, maybe I should just get out my highlighter. That's what I'm gonna do, highlight. Largely outside of the college-educated class, okay? In 2019, only 63% of children in the US lived with married parents, down from 77% in 1980. So it's a total share of the US population. But you can see the difference in these numbers, right, between our kind of college-educated and non-college educated classes and where the shift has come. Nope, black highlighter's not gonna be good. Okay, so 84% of children whose mothers had a 4-year college degree lived with married parents. In 1980 it was 90. So that's only shifted 6%. Same thing, same time period, 60% of children whose mothers had only a high school diploma lived with married parents. It was 83% in 1980. So that one has declined 23%, right? So this change in children who live with married parents has a strong class component, right? It is, very minor here, and it is very big here, right? A 26 or 23% drop is a huge drop. Okay. Family and home environment influences just about everything, right? This is your locus of primary socialization, and it's where you're going to get most of the resources you need while you are growing, right? So it influences school and labor market performance. So college-educated adults are more likely to marry and raise kids in two-parent families, right? This is, you could call this sort of a latent function, right, of the college system is it sorts people by class, right? So that you get, in university college, you get, middle class people. The middle class, they meet and marry each other. So you don't get a lot of class mixing because we've kind of sorted people. You go to college, you go to university, you're with other middle class people, right? So what kind of resources is that? Well, money, time, and energy, right? Money being important, but time and energy being important as well. So it creates a bunch of economic differences across household types, produces huge economic differences in children's lives. And we'll kind of dig into that as we go. Okay. Now here, what we're going to do is take college as a marker of socioeconomic status, right? And we're going to roughly kind of think of, college as sort of equaling a middle class. Middle and probably a little bit of upper class. Oops, I can write good. That looks like udder. Okay, I'm going to try that again. The udder class, the class that milks cows. All right, try that again. Middle and upper. There we go. I like my other pen better. Okay. We see higher earnings and employment for college-educated adults, right? So if you go to college, you're going to make more money. Even though, I know I told you in education that, we're seeing a lot of inflation, you're still better today to have a university or college degree than not to have one. Okay, and the children of college-educated adults are likely to earn degrees and have those same higher earnings. This one, we call this the intergenerational, I won't rate it, intergenerational transfer of advantage, right? Having more advantaged parents passes that advantage down to you as well. Okay, so we have high rates of income inequality in the US, right, between the highest and lowest, and our children of high-income parents tend to have more resources and opportunities, while those of our unmarried parents face disadvantages. All right, so inequality drives demographic change at a household level, and household change exacerbates inequality. So what does this mean? Well, things like low education and skill levels hinder economic security, and those with lower education are less likely to marry, right? So if being married is an economic advantage, and again, this is kind of the same argument that Regnerus was making, right? It's, the rich and middle class, they get marriage. And marriage has benefits. And those benefits are economic, their time, that's a clock, and their energy. That's a lightning bolt. Or a E or something. Just pretend it's a lightning bolt. It's as good as the one on Harry Potter's forehead in like half the Harry Potter movies, where it's very variable in terms of quality of the makeup. Okay, so what does it do? Obviously, children from lower income families have fewer resources. It affects boys more, right? We talked a little bit about boys earlier, right? And if you remember, Leonard Sachs, makes an argument about a masculinity crisis. But boys from disadvantaged homes face school and criminal justice issues, right? They're more likely to drop out of school, more likely to get involved in drugs, more likely to get involved in crime. Girls from disadvantaged homes, more likely to become young unmarried mothers. So it's a sort of a cycle, right? You get a generational persistence of inequality that's really, really hard to break. And it gets anchored down in social class, social beliefs, the behaviors of certain classes, and how inflexible social class becomes, right? If you want to put it in kind of economic terms, potentially what Kearney is describing is a barrier to economic mobility. Oops. Sorry, that's me writing badly. Or your ability to move up the class system, right? You kind of get, based on family structure, you can get stuck at certain socioeconomic levels. Okay. I know these slides are they're super white. I'm sorry. There's just a lot of text, and putting graphics on them gives me less space to write fun stuff on my slides. Okay. So, child rearing, right? How you're raised as a child depends in large part on the family you come from. And better resourced parents are going to have different styles of parenting, right? And marriage as an institution provides high levels of resources and long-term stability to children. Again, this is very similar to that argument that Regnerus was making, right? You marry, one of the things you do is you pool resources. I don't know how to write resources. Oh, right, okay. Right, you get to pool your resources, right? Bring them together, and you can mutually support each other. Now, in the US, cohabitation could deliver similar results, but it doesn't for whatever reason, right? And like Europe, it's different. In Europe, cohabiting relationships are relatively stable, and they provide relatively good support for children. In the US, it's not the same, right? Cohabitation, is pretty unstable. We'll talk about that in a second. And it doesn't deliver, similar shared resources. And one of the things that Kearney claims is that marriage, when it comes to relationship breakdown between parents, right? The social science data isn't particularly mixed. Your parents getting divorced is hard on kids, right? And we have now, 40, 50 years of pretty solid data on this, right? There are ways that can be handled better, but it's rarely a positive situation unless there's abuse in the house. So marriage breakdown or relationship breakdown of your parents is bad. And what she says is, divorce or marriage offers an extra layer of institutional inertia, which is a fun way of saying divorce is hard. Right? Because marriage is a legal structure. Breaking up a marriage requires time, it requires legal fees, right? It's difficult. And in some cases, right, not getting divorced is easier than getting divorced would be, right? Because, you have to go through all the craziness of a divorce. It might be easier just to work on your relationship. There's a kind of institutional inertia, right? Marriage will keep parents together for longer than not, cohabiting parents, where the division of resources is considerably simpler. Okay. And yeah, all of the empirical evidence, and she cites it all in the book, children thrive more in strong, stable families, right? So when we're talking about youth, that's what's important. The decline in marriage has led to more children being born to unmarried parents, and the breakdown of two-parent married families is generally not good for children economically or socially. Okay. Did I just double up my slides? No. Okay, sorry. They all start to look the same to me as well. Sorry, I made too many white slides. I need to, when I fix these up for next year, I got to put some color on these. Okay, advantage of two-parent families, right? Stable support for children, and obviously better emotional and social development. So, more stable, more resourced, right? And, two parents, her chapter on this is titled Two is Greater Than One, right? Pretty straightforward. The class divide in marriage and family structures increases inequality, right? So the married are going to do better. They're going to get more resources, and that's going to roll generation to generation and they're going to be more upwardly mobile, right? Higher rates of upward mobility in areas with two-parent families. Consequently, lower rates of upward mobility in areas that are dominated by one-parent families, right? Okay. And she says ignoring these facts is inherently kind of counterproductive. But there is a social stigma to it, right? And she says even amongst economists who are super data-driven, right? Economists are really focused on just data and information. And she says it's still really, really hard to talk about it with economists. Oh no, is the O of the Tears of My Student Cup peeling off? That would be bad. Okay. All right, we'll do a couple more and then we'll take a break because I could use a break too. I got some hard numbers here in a sec. All right, so I think it's pretty obvious two-parent families are less common than they used to be, right? Now, one thing that is, and I think we touched on this when we talked about Rigneris, the decline in marriage is not due to committed partnerships without marriage, right? Cohabitation rose for a while, but the rate of cohabitation stalled quite a long time ago as well. Most unmarried parents are not in marriage-like relationships, right? Not living with their partner, but not married. There are certainly some of those, but that isn't the norm. Children of unmarried parents, 80% live with just their mother. And increasingly what we see is a trend of children growing up only with their mother, right? With dad not around at all. Okay. Now, this is not, according to Kearney, driven by economically successful women, right? Women who decide that they just want to have children because they want children and they don't need no man, right? The old a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle kind of argument. Okay, so the reality is, economically successful women, would have the resources to have children without, a partner, right? So at least in terms of economic resources, they would do okay. Emotional, and someone to support you, not as much. The reality is, single mothers, in large part, are neither college educated nor high income, right? Most of them are working class and poor. So, some of the challenges: financial support and primary giver responsibilities, right? So what do single mothers face? Right, they are responsible solely, typically, and we can talk about childcare. Childcare is, or not childcare, child support. Child support is a system that's supposed to help women, single mothers get support from the fathers of their children. It doesn't work super well, and the arrears in terms of child support are huge. I think it's trillions of dollars in the U.S. That arrears, how behind people are. So they have to, financially support and give primary care to kids, and they lack any support aside from maybe, grandparents, aunts, and uncles when tired or sick, right? So you have to care for your kids, all the time, and especially when you're young, this is a heavy burden. Okay, so the marriage decline is most pronounced in adults without a 4-year college degree, as we kind of established on that first slide, right? It's only 6% for those with a college degree, but a whopping 23% decline for those without. Okay. So the rise in in one-parent families has been especially amongst our economically disadvantaged groups. Okay. Our college educated continue to marry and have higher earnings with each other. All right. I feel like I'm repeating myself here. Did I put this slide twice? Oh, no, this is repeated. So children of college educated parents, basically, they benefit from tons of resources, right? you have two, well, it's all right, two. Now it looks like 12. Hang on. I love my pen, but sometimes I make a mess. You get two high-income parents. So that is tons of, resources. And the kind of average salaries of, college-educated people in the US has been on an upward trajectory. It's slowed down in recent years, but they've still been kind of doing economically better than those without a college degree. Adults without a college degree, their incomes have stagnated, which means in terms of the actual wages have risen, but when you measure it relative to inflation, it's basically flat since about the 1970s, right? So they have seen flat earnings since the 1970s, right? In terms of inflation, they can afford, about the same amount, if not slightly less. But fewer of them are getting married, and more of them are likely to set up separate households, right? So mom and dad are going to have separate households if dad is involved at all. Okay, here's some hard numbers, and maybe do I have my, I want to show you some of these before we go. Okay, so children of college-educated mothers, 12% live with an unpartnered mother, right? So not a whole lot. Those with non-college educated mothers, 29% live with an unpartnered mother. It's 30% if the mother doesn't even have a high school diploma, right? And the college gap, and we'll talk about ethnicities, right, exists among Black, white, and Hispanic families. Asian families, we can look at the statistics, have high rates of two-parent families regardless of education level. And it's something like, I think for college, it's like 88% of Asian families are two-parent. And I mean, this translates into all sorts of things, but amongst other things, how to put this? If we look at the groups in the US that have the highest incomes, it's Asian, Southeast Asian, white, and then Latino, and then Black. I guess Latino, so I'm running out of space, Black, and then Indigenous. So the two that have the highest rate, or the three that have the highest rates of two-parent families are Asians, Southeast Asians, and white people, right? And consequently, they have the highest rates of college degrees and the highest incomes. And their kids tend to do better in general. Okay. Now, this rise in unpartnered mothers is driven principally by mothers who are never married, not due to rising divorce rates. And this makes sense because if we know our marriage rates have been dropping since the 1980s, fewer people are getting married. And again, it's not due to an increase in unmarried cohabiting couples. Cohabitation has flatlined roughly since the 1990s. All right. Maybe we'll take a pause. I need a pause. Let's take a pause. Let's take 20 minutes. Let's come back at 2:50 because my tea is too hot. I need to go put cold water in it. The tears of my students are scorchingly warm. This was a gift from a student, by the way. I didn't make this for myself. So I need to cool down my tea, and I'm sure you're having fun being bombarded by entirely white slides by an entirely white professor. So come back in, at 2:50, and we'll keep talking about this a little bit. Oh, I'm gonna pause that for a sec. Okay, so let's keep going here. Try to get through this as quick as we can. All right, so we're talking about trends in family structure, right? And you can kind of see it on this chart, right? If we go back to 1980, 77% of children lived with married parents. It's now down to 63%. More 21% now live with unpartnered mothers, and 9% live in other family structures. Okay, so we've seen big jumps in, or big declines in the rate of children living with married parents. Okay, yeah, or increase in children living with unmarried mothers or unpartnered mothers, right? 21% of children live with an unpartnered mother, and some percent, 8% live with unmarried parents, or a parent and an unmarried partner, right? So that would be your cohabitors. 4.8% live with unpartnered fathers, and 4.3 don't live with parents at all. So live with grandparents, aunts and uncles, or foster care. Okay. So in terms of cohabiting, right? If you want to see or unpartnered parents, how often they stayed together. So despite the fact that the parents, unmarried parents often said when their child was born that they wanted to stay together, only about a third of unmarried parents remain together by a child's 5th birthday, right? So that means 2/3 don't. So high levels of instability and family complexity, and about a third of fathers had disappeared from their children's lives altogether 5 years on. So again, somewhat less stable or far less stable than marriage in terms of that. Oh, this question. Sorry, I had to look this up because I remembered something about this because I remembered reading something about it, but I had to check it because I didn't remember where it came from. So, do the negative effects of divorce on children also apply to children who have lost / temporarily lost a parent to other causes? So, there was one study that came out in 2022 in demographic research, which I remember reading, and it found, and what it was considered very provocative at the time, that divorce was actually more harmful than the death of a parent in terms of outcomes. Now, this was only true in terms of high status, high income children, because they experienced a greater decline in parental resources when they went to living with only a single parent, right? Than did lower income. Lower income, like when it came to divorce for lower income young people, the decline in resources is less because they had less resources to start with. When you look at high status, higher wealth, your parent dying is actually less harmful than your parents getting divorced, right? It has less long-term negative consequences on educational attainment and economic attainment in the long term, according to one study, right? So that's one study in demographic research. So I didn't find anything, and I don't know anything about temporary loss of a parent, due to something like military deployment. Incarceration definitely has negative consequences, right? If one of your parents gets incarcerated, that is genuinely devastating. With a military deployment, it's probably you lose all the resources, right? That person's no longer an earner and they're out of your life for a set period of time. Military deployment, at very least, you typically don't see a decline in financial resources, right? With a parent still earning money and still sending money home. So likely less of that, but I don't know any hard data on that particular one. Okay, hopefully I answered that. When it comes to status, kids being born to teenage moms could be seen as lower status than moms in their 30s. Could this shift in perception affect TFR? I mean, potentially. Definitely. Are you saying teenage births are good for TFR? Well, that's a provocative claim. Yeah, I don't know how to parse that question. I guess certainly, you would probably have higher status as an older mom than as a much younger mom. And so, yeah, that might affect TFR in terms of shortening that kind of window where people will have kids. That would be my guess. Okay. For marriage being less valuable for adults with no college degree, why would they set up separate households? Wouldn't pooling resources be beneficial? Yes, so that's definitely true, and that's sort of the part of the point, is whatever the reasons, and this is the kind of point that Rigneris was making with this distinction between kind of foundations and capstone marriage, it would be valuable, especially for adults with no college degree because they have fewer resources, so pooling them would be beneficial. But for whatever reason, they don't do so, right? And it's this question of marriageability. Are particularly the men in these relationships considered marriageable from an economic perspective? And it would appear that the case is no. And then for those men who are marriageable, they have so many more options that they're delaying that choice for quite a long time. Okay. All right, I give up. Okay. All right, so family structure by race and ethnicity to show some of the kind of differences. So as a total percentage of the US population, right, in terms of children, a little over half of them are white, 13% of them are black, 6% are Asian, and a little under a quarter of them are Hispanic or Latino. Okay, in terms of our share of living with married parents, 77% of white children live with their parents. So right, well above that national average. 88% of Asian children live with married parents. 2/3 roughly of Hispanic children, and just over a third of black children live with married parents. So, I mean, again, what I'll say, these two groups are broadly the ones that are the most economically upwardly mobile, especially this group, right? The top earners in the US are Asians. Right now here we're lumping together, Asian, Southeast Asian as one group. You could split them out, as distinct populations. This particular data doesn't. Well, I'll put it this way. This has gotten to be such a phenomenon in terms of upward mobility that for a few years, places like illustrious universities like Harvard had been artificially lowering the number of admissions for Asian students, right? And this is something that they were taken to court over because, basically they were over-admitting other groups, particularly Hispanic and Black, even though on GPA, SAT scores, and all of that stuff, Asian students outperformed every other group, right? By a vast margin in all of these things. And family structure, so this is true of all the Ivy League schools, all the elite institutions, Harvard, Yale, MIT, which is not an Ivy, but it's MIT, Stanford, Caltech, right? All of the great American universities. In terms of their percentage of the population, it's not a big percentage. They're vastly overrepresented in elite universities and the highest income circles. If you go to the big tech companies in the US, Asians, Southeast Asian are vastly overrepresented in those really high salary positions. And I think there's a case to be made that it has a lot to do with family structure and the amount of resources that they get as children. Okay. Impact of mothers' education. Okay, so in terms of living in intact families, just for our, the white part of that cohort, so, the 55% of white children, of those whose mothers are college educated, right, 88% live with married parents. It's 69% of those with a high school diploma, and 60% for no high school, right? So these two groups are below the average for white children in the US. Okay. In terms of, marriage patterns, if we look at, children who live with unpartnered mothers, were their mothers ever married? When it comes to Black women, 70% are never married. Hispanic, it's 54%. white, it's 38. And, for that small percentage of like 12% of Asian children who live with unpartnered mothers, only 32% were never married, right? So about a third. So there's significant kind of differences along not only socioeconomic, but racial lines in terms of marriage patterns and therefore those resources. Okay. Unpartnered mothers with a college degree are more likely to have been married, right? So that's the group where you see more divorce. And that trend is consistent along all racial and ethnic kind of groups. Previously married parents tend to have more resources, right? So they, even though they're now divorced, they tend to be college educated, and B, they tend to more evenly get resources from the non-resident partner. So higher involvement of fathers in previously married scenarios. So, while it probably stinks to be here, right? You're white or Asian, your parents are divorced, and all of that, you're more likely to have more resources because your father is going to still be more involved, being a higher earner and all of that. Disproportionately, the negative effects are going to be concentrated in, Black particularly and Hispanic groups who are less likely to have this arrangement. So again, if you want to think of it as a social justice issue, it definitely has a strong social justice component. Oh, child support compliance, there are the numbers. Right, so child support, right, which is supposed to be a system that mitigates some of these negative effects of, unmarried parents having fewer resources. So obviously, it's far from 100% of mothers receiving support, right? It's considerably less than that. And assignment and compliance with child support is incomplete and varies in the US from state to state. So according to Census Bureau data, half of custodial parents had legal or informal child support agreements. 70% had received some of their owed payments, but only 44% had received the full payment. And that full payment is a lot less than you might think. Average child support payment was $3,500 per year per custodial parent, right? So it's about, $3,500 a year in terms of child support. And I have a few friends who are in this kind of situation. Actually, my one friend married a woman who had a child from a previous relationship. And yeah, the amount that they received from the father of the child was relatively low. They said it was enough to pay for like her gymnastics class and swimming lessons for the year, but it wasn't much more than that. Okay, so $33.7 billion in child support was owed to custodial parents per year, right? Only about 60% of that amount was received, so 40% of that amount builds year over year, and it's now in the hundreds of billions of dollars in arrears. Okay. Now, the US is kind of weirdly unique in terms of, the number of children living with one parent, right? The global average, the US is about 23%. The global average is 7%. Now, most of the globe is far more conservative and traditional than the United States is. Canada is kind of somewhere in the middle at about 15%. And Mexico, very Catholic, very traditional in lots of ways, is only about 7%, right? So it's right on the global average. So the US is a little bit unusual in that distribution, but you see similar kind of trends in Canada and in the European Union. Okay. In other places, higher education correlates typically with two-parent households. 79% of children of highly educated mothers in the EU live in married parent homes, right? So it's still still a pretty high number, and it's still a pretty high number. It's still a lot. In terms of cohabitation, right? Cohabitation has been growing in the EU in a way it hasn't been in the US, and the trend is in the EU they're pretty stable, right? Cohabitation in the EU is much more of a kind of marriage-like relationship than it is in the US. Okay. The Western world seems to be trending in similar directions, though. The U.S. rate increased from the 1980s to somewhere between 2011 and 2015 period, and similar patterns were observed in other places. The UK, Norway, Spain, and France. Right, we are seeing a growth in single-parent households led by women. Okay, I couldn't clear that before. There it is. Okay, so what do kids get out of, married parent relationships? So they get to see parental love and cooperation. They observe their parents loving each other and working through challenges. And this has knock-on effects for their relationships later, right? So it influences children's expectations of love and shapes their approach to relationships in adulthood. And I mean, again, this has sort of follow-on effects. If your parents remained married, all the way through your childhood, you yourself are more likely to get married and remain married. If if your parents got divorced, you're more likely to get divorced. If your parents were never together, you're more likely to be a single parent, right? Okay. And yeah, all we've been talking about, two-parent families have significant resource advantages, which is backed up by a bunch of economics data. And put it in kind of absolute terms, single mothers are 5 times more likely to live in poverty than married couple families. Single fathers are nearly twice as likely to live in poverty. Now, that likely has to do with, when we talk about the working class and the way the labor market for the working class is structured, men will tend to have, higher income jobs, right? Things like trades, transport, are the dominant employers for men who aren't college educated. For women, it tends to be jobs in the service industry that are relatively low wage. Things like retail, childcare, right? So like daycare, which is really low wage, despite what it does. Retail, childcare, beauty. Right, so hairdressers, doing someone's nails, other beauty services, massage therapy, these sorts of things. And then, what's the last one? Hospitality. And that's hotels and restaurants, right? So these make more money than these, right? So women who are non-college educated tend to have worse jobs in terms of pay than men who are non-college educated in general. Okay, so that's why single fathers are less likely to be in poverty, because they're more likely to be in trades and transport, which pay a little bit better. All right, so 22% of families headed by a woman without a spouse live in poverty. 11.5%, so that's better than a fifth. And 11.5% of families headed by a man without a spouse live in poverty. Only 4% of married couple families live in poverty, right? So, I mean, that's, this is nearly triple. I can write 3 times, and that's what, like 5 times? So, you're considerably more likely to live in poverty if you're in a single parent household. All right. Poor adults are more likely to become single parents too, right? So it has that self-perpetuating vicious cycle kind of built in. Okay. Where am I at here? 6 more. Okay. So, childhood outcomes, right? Children with married mothers generally have better outcomes, right? And this is economic outcomes, career and job attainment and education, right? They get more education. They will end up making more money. Oh, and if we talk about emotional cognitive, right? Typically higher as well. They do better from an emotional cognitive perspective. So, yeah, and these gaps persist even with same age and education levels of mothers, right? So, if you compare, two kids who are kind of working class or poor, one has, unmarried or unpartnered mother, one has married parents, there's going to be a gap between them. And if you move up, and you end up with college educated, there's still a gap, right? So that gap persists, same age, education level of mothers. Doesn't matter. There's still a gap as compared to their peers whose parents are married. All right. So when we look at the relative disadvantages, the data is really clear. There's a consistent trend of disadvantage compared to two-parent households. And that the support from non-resident fathers is generally insufficient, right? Okay, higher income married parents explains some of that gap, right? You're more likely to be college educated and married. And there are policy prescriptions. They're at the end of her book. They're interesting, can help increase income for single mother families. However, it doesn't make up all of the deficits, right? Even income replacement makes up some of the differences, but it doesn't make up all of it, particularly, the emotional cognitive kind of differences. So even with income supports, differences in experiences and outcomes remain. So it's not an easy thing to remedy from a policy perspective. You can throw money at the problem, but that fixes some of the economic difficulties, but not some of the other ones. All right, benefits. So task specialization in marriage. This is one of the things that marriage does really well, is what's called task specialization. And you can think of it, right, if you want to talk about it in Weberian kind of terms, you can talk about, marriage as being a great way to create a division of labor. Okay, within a household, right? So, and think of it this way, right? You are good at some things. If you have a partner, that person will be good at some things as well. They may be the same things, but they're probably somewhat different. So, you can specialize in the things you are good at, right? So it allows partners to focus on their strengths, right? For me and my wife, I'll put it this way. Her strength is not cooking. I'm a much better cook than she is, but, quite a lot. So I do like 90% of the cooking because, no one wants to eat her food. That's the way it goes. She has terrible instincts and terrible execution, and she's finally come to a point where she can accept that. Terrible cook, good baker, terrible cook. So I do all the cooking. There are other things, obviously that she is better at than I am. I can't think of them right now, but I know they're there. No, I just don't want to reveal too much. She's definitely better with the kids and being, soft and cuddly and dealing with emotions than I am. Despite my otherwise cuddly demeanor, I'm not necessarily the best when people start to cry about nothing. I turn into my father and it's like, suck it up, right? I mean, it's only gushing blood. How bad could it be? Okay, so allows you to focus on strengths and increases efficiency in managing tasks, right? So the converse is also true, right? If you are a single parent family, right, you have to handle all of the household responsibilities, whether you're good at them or not. And that is, time. There is no division of labor, right? It can't be like, I don't know, my sister-in-law and my structure their household responsibility in what they call blue tasks and pink tasks. So she does the pink task and he does the blue task. So blue tasks are things like getting the oil changed in vehicles, right? Yard maintenance. There's some other things, right? Household construction tasks. Other stuff is taking out the trash is classed in blue tasks. Cooking, baking, some of the other child care. When the kids were little, bathing the kids was pink tasks. And they had a very interesting taxonomy. It's like, oh, can you take out the trash? I'm sorry, honey, that's a blue task. That's you. And they would actually say that to each other. So, you split things according to your specializations. If you don't have a partner, though, you can't split those tasks, right? You have to do everything. So it reduces things like stress and workload, right? And especially burnout. And, promotes teamwork and cooperation and is a good model for kids of how to divide labor. Okay, I know, I promise I'm almost done with this particular topic. All right, so emotional behavioral problems. Children of divorced parents exhibit considerably more issues across a wide range of kind of problems, right? More particularly for boys, more externalizing disorders, right? Violence, physical aggression. For girls, you see many more internalizing disorders. So things like depression, anxiety amongst parents who are divorced. Okay. And yeah, we've got lots of studies here, but you can look at this one from Gruber in 2004, where he went back, and took US Census data from 1960, 1970, 1980, and 1990, and he found generally increased divorce led to worse outcome for kids, lower levels of education, lower levels of income, more marital churn, all right, so more likely that more marriages and separations in their lives, and an increased likelihood of living in poverty. Are children better off when their parents have common law married versus just dating? Or is that also considered non-married? That's also considered that would be cohabiting, right? Versus just dating. I'm assuming that the question is like they are co-resident. I think from a legal perspective, after a very short period of time, you are considered to be common law married, at least in Canada. It doesn't have the same stressors, the same benefit as formal marriage. It seems to have something to do with that institutional momentum and how unstable those relationships are. But I mean, I would presume common law married would be better than just dating, because that sounds like a more stable relationship. But I think both of those are considered technically non-married. Good question though. Bless you. Oh dear. Spring allergy season. Oh my, oh me, oh my. Okay, so family structures and educational attainment. So how much education are you going to get? 2022 study on family structure and education. Family structure is increasingly important for education. Living with one or two parents predicts college completion, right? And living with two parents, you have a better chance of completing college. That obviously has knock-on effect, right? Economically, you earn more money if you have a college degree, so you're going to do better in life. Okay, and the stronger predictive power for those turning 28 between 2006 and 2015, after which time it gets a little bit weaker. So, subsidizing pre-college investments for single-parent families was more impactful than tuition subsidies or cash transfers. So, if you can make up some of the income differences, when children are younger, that mitigates some of those differences a little bit more than than giving them tuition subsidies or cash transfers later in life, because by then some of the effects the negative effects of having grown up poor are going to have already been baked in. Okay, this 2009 study on family structures and young adult outcomes using 1997 National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. Growing up without both biological parents leads to lower attainment, higher incidence of unmarried parenthood or incarceration in young adults. And again, there are some racial differences here. You're going to see much more of this in certain communities because they have higher rates of non-married parents, right? All right. And income disparities during childhood. Average childhood family income is $35,000 for children of unmarried mothers versus $82,454 for children of married mothers, right? So it's more than double. This is more than double that number. So children of single mothers spent 36.4% of their childhood in poverty versus 8.6% for married mothers. Okay. A couple of other things to say. I think I got 2 slides left. And then we'll talk about work for the remainder of the class. All right, resource sharing and co-parenting amongst unmarried parents, right? Long-term partnerships and shared commitment can bridge those gaps. You see that more amongst divorced couples, right? And especially fathers with more resources. Cohabiting partnerships are less stable, as we established, so they offer less benefit than, divorced ones even. Okay, impact of remarriage and step families. This is kind of an interesting one because I get this question a lot in SOC 100 when I talk about families, is what happens with step parents? Because our percentage of, step parent families is growing, right? Remarriages after first marriages is an increased number. Step-parent relationships on the whole don't seem to be particularly beneficial. Okay, so one of the things that happens, when people start a new relationship after the end of one, I'm going to highlight this, they often the focus shifts from resources to relationships, right? Resourcing children, they focus more on the new relationship that they are in. So if you had a choice, children fare way better in 2-parent biological families. This one is an interesting one. Stepmothers in particular tend to invest less in stepchildren's health, particularly female children, right? So if you're a girl and you have a stepmother, she is less likely to invest in your health, both physical and mental, than your biological mother would. This is particularly true also if she is bringing existing children from another relationship into this new relationship. And if that sounds a little bit like the plot of Cinderella, the wicked stepmother and wicked stepsisters, maybe, just maybe, that's because, the people of the past knew something that we apparently have forgotten, which is, step-parents aren't always good. It doesn't always turn out well for the stepchild, right? Sometimes you end up being the servant for your step-parents. No, that's probably unlikely in today's world, but you don't see kind of resource benefits for stepchildren, and certainly the emotional benefits are relatively limited. Adolescents with stepfathers show worse behavioral outcomes than they would obviously in their 2-parent families. The other one, and I'm sure there's wonderful stepfathers out there, but if you in a household with girls who are stepchildren, your chances of being sexually abused go up 100 times on average, right? Again, there's wonderful stepfathers, but the odds of being sexually abused go up about 100 times if there is a stepfather in the household. Now, this is still better, technically speaking, than if you have a rotating cast. Your you're living with an unmarried mother and you have, rotating boyfriends coming into the household where, depending on, a few factors, the chances of sexual abuse can go up to 1,000 times. But, it's definitely, a risk. Stepfathers are a risky bet in that sense from a statistical point of view. Though again, I know there are great stepdads out there. Same-sex parenting, right? So same-sex couples, so the research is relatively limited. One of the problems with doing research on same-sex couples with children is there's not very many of them. So they're hard to track down in large statistical samples, right? So it is a little bit complicated in that sense. However, kind of the preliminary studies that have been done that looked at same-sex couples suggest that there's very little difference in terms of outcomes for children with regard to same-sex couples. So two parents is, oops, that's a highlighter. I didn't want that. Two parents here is still better than one. You get the resource advantages regardless of the genders of the parents. And we have no empirical evidence of a difference in outcomes between same-sex and opposite-sex parents. Children of same-sex parent households seem to fare roughly as well as those from different, opposite-sex parents' households, as long as the same factors hold, education level of their parents, parents remaining married, and all of that stuff. So, I think I have that. I had that somewhere else. Okay. So, comparative stability of cohabitation versus marriage. I've already established this. Cohabitation is less stable, and that instability leads to gaps in resources and outcomes. Okay. So, marriage. Now, you might be thinking that I am saying, everybody get married. Everybody. Now, there is, I think, a slight caveat to this, is that marriage obviously brings additional resources, but that also depends on the mother and father's resources. You can, and this is particularly true of fathers without positive resources, right? So someone who is unemployed or doesn't bring positive resources seems to bring no gain. And again, this is why you probably see more benefit in that college-educated bracket, because fathers are going to be bringing considerable resources. Violent, chaotic fathers, fathers with alcohol or drug problems, frequently bring have negative effects on their children if they are brought into the household. So these are not marriageable men. We have, increasingly a really high percentage of births to men with no positive resources. By Kearney's estimate, close to 40% of births in the US are to men who do not bring positive resources into the home. And it's approximately 70% of births to non-college educated mothers are fathered by men with no positive resources. So there is a lot of men that don't bring a lot of resources, and a lot of children being born to men that are not marriageable. They don't bring resources, and so they are either neutral or a detriment to households that they are in. Now, obviously, all of this means single parenthood is a significant social problem. When what it leads to is an advantage class, your two-parent class, is advantaged consistently. And it's not a kind of moralistic argument, right? It's just an economics one. It's a significant social problem. And it extends beyond child rearing, to why so many men are unfit as marriage partners or engaged fathers. Why are you seeing, 40% of births in the US to men who don't bring positive resources to the relationship or to the home? This is a significant social problem that has a lot to do with men and their struggles and the fact that they are not, net contributors to the society in a lot of ways. Okay. Does modern task specialization continue to pursue specific gender roles despite a trend towards more gender equality? So it really depends. So there's a really strong socioeconomic class component to this. The more educated you are, the higher income you are, the less likely you are to be sort of tied into fairly rigid gender stereotypes or gender roles. You're more likely to have a much more egalitarian kind of breakdown in terms of gender roles, right? So I mean, like, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law are relatively unusual for how gender, in terms of kind of middle class people, given their education levels, they're both, university educated. Given that they're kind of split, of blue task, pink task is a little bit unusual. People are usually much more egalitarian about it and kind of go to strengths. As you work your way down, socioeconomically, what you're going to find is it becomes increasingly less progressive as people have less education and as they have less income. And particularly, like, when you're talking working class, once people have children, you'll often see a really traditional split, much more likely to say be a stay-at-home mom, particularly because, and this may shift in Canada a little bit, although the data's not promising. It's often not particularly economically viable for working class women to return to work and put their children in childcare, right? Because the childcare costs often come close to or actually exceed the amount of salary they would be making out in the workforce, especially if they're in, beauty services, retail, hospitality, childcare, right? They're pretty low wage jobs. So what tends to happen, you have more women staying at home to take care of kids. And then once you're home, that gender kind of split in tasks really divides very traditionally, because one person's at home and the other one's out working, probably working, as much overtime as possible, to support, however many people are in the household. And that, is going to mean that a lot of those domestic tasks that otherwise might be split then move back into very traditional kind of spaces. So it's complicated. Okay, no, that's an interesting question. There we go. Okay, so in terms of pre-college investments, things that would alleviate financial difficulties and sort of that resource gap prior to someone being college age has more impact, because it's, it allows things like, potentially things like pre-K, right? Getting people into preschool and pre-K programs, maybe some enrichment, extracurricular activities, reducing the amount that maybe mom has to work, right? Because if you're in a single parent household, you often have people holding, especially as you go non-college educated, working 2 jobs, maybe 3, in order to support yourself in those low wage jobs, means parents have less time. If you can give income supports prior to the point where someone would be potentially going to college, maybe mom can be home more, right? Work just a regular 9 to 5 and not have to work additional hours, and therefore have more resources to devote to kids in general. So that would be more impactful than waiting until someone's already gone through a childhood, of significant poverty, potentially, less resources, less enrichment, less extracurriculars, and all of those things, and then trying to make it up once they're already an adult, because they're less likely to have even applied to go to college, right? They're more likely to have, dropped out of school, become involved in crime, and developed kind of negative social patterns at that point. So the earlier the intervention comes, the more likely it is to be successful in this particular case, is what Kearney says. Okay, go. My pen sometimes clears it and sometimes doesn't. Okay, that is it for this argument. Okay, how many? Oh, so good for time. All right, I know you all want to do work now, so let's start a little bit. We'll finish. This is a quick one, and we'll finish it on Wednesday and talk about one other topic, and then midterm. And I'll have your midterms marked, I more or less promise you, by Wednesday. More or less promise you is a terrible promise, by the way. I 94% think maybe. Yes, I'm bad at my job. Okay. No, it's time consuming. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about youth and work. And like I said, this is a really quick unit without too much data in it. Oh no. Oh good. I thought I was frozen, but my pen is not working. Whatever will I do? Sometimes my pen loses connection. I will try one more time. All right, so let's talk youth in the labor market. There it is, huzzah. I love you, pen. All right, so youth employment, right? So when we talk about labor, young people are typically considerably more disadvantaged when it comes to the labor market than their older peers for lots of reasons. And like in Canada, you can roughly say with pretty good accuracy that youth unemployment is roughly 2 times the average rate of unemployment. Now that varies a little bit regionally, but it's pretty close, right? So like Alberta right now, I think Alberta is running about a 7.6% rate of unemployment. Youth unemployment in Alberta right now is about 17.8%. So it's a little bit higher than 2 times in Alberta, but nationally, I think it's pretty close to 2 times the average rate of unemployment. So when we talk about youth employment, young people are more likely to be affected by aggregate economic conditions than their older peers. So what does that mean? When the economy goes down, right, when you go into recession or economic declines, young people are the ones who are going to feel that first, right? So they are, typically the last ones who are hired because they're the youngest. So the first ones to be let go in economic downturns. And because they're the ones most likely to be seeking employment, they tend to, find that there's less hiring during economic downswings. And companies, when they are consolidating resources during economic downswings, will typically want to keep their best, most competent workers, the ones with the most capacity, typically the ones they can load up with more responsibilities. Now, there are certain exceptions, right? Sometimes older workers that are really high wage might be replaced by 2 or even 3 younger workers at much lower wages. But typically, right, in high status, high value fields, companies want to keep their most well-connected, competent employees during downswings because they can put more work on them. So you get less hiring, and even internships, both paid and unpaid, tend to decline during downturns because there's nothing to do, right? You have nothing to give your intern to do if you don't have any work. I know, a couple of years ago, I guess it was about 2015, my friend, we're still friends, he's not dead, but he was running at the time, he's kind of an entrepreneur, he's running a totally different thing now, but he was running an engineering company, and that company hired a lot of co-op students out of the U of A. Now, prior to 2015, I think they had 4 co-op students every year, but 2015, oil crashed, right? It went from like $100 a barrel down to like 50, and suddenly there was no work in the engineering field. And he said, I would love to hire these co-op students, because they're cheap labor, but he's like, I don't have anything for them to do. So he stopped participating in the co-op program. And I don't think he ever resumed after that. And then the company ended up going bankrupt, but don't worry, he's doing just fine. He's one of those guys, he's always doing just fine. He always has a scheme. I expect him either to be a billionaire or to end up in prison. I don't know which. Okay. Now, if we talk about employment patterns, right? Generally speaking, generationally, what we see is a decline in youth employment over time, right? Fewer young people in Gen Z are employed today compared to millennials and Gen X at the same points in their lives, right? So as of 2018, right, only about 18% of Gen Z teenagers, those aged 15 to 17, were employed, compared to, better than a quarter of millennials at the same time, and 41% of Gen Xers in 1986 when they were at about the same age. Among young adults, that pattern holds relatively steady, right? 62, those 18 to 22, 62% of Gen Zers were employed in 2018, compared to millennials, 71% of millennials in 2002. Gosh, dates are not my friend. And Gen X, 79% of Gen Xers in 1986, right? So Gen Z generally less likely to be employed. And this, this is your slow life plan, right? This is what Twenge's talking about. Some of those markers of kind of adulthood are less present in our Gen Z youth, right? They're hitting those markers later, and they do certain things less than previous generational cohorts. Okay, so where, Gen Z and millennials, kind of what is their kind of preferred, in-demand jobs for Gen Z job seekers, right? Clustered in things like technology, right? A lot of the jobs that are available for them are things like software engineering, right? This is where the demand is for Gen Z workers. People are looking for, things like software engineers. I'm sorry to say sociologist is not on that list, and neither is, psychology student. Sorry, these are all, what you would think of as these pretty high value fields. Okay. And who are, top companies that are attracting Gen Z workers, again, are all companies in the tech field, right? Millennials, kind of similar, although I'm always surprised with IBM, how high IBM is on that, because IBM is this old stodgy tech company that I never think of as particularly innovative, right? But you recognize the names on this list, except for maybe Deloitte, which is a financial firm, and Robert Half, I still don't know what that is. But kind of the places that Gen Zers are finding employment, right, largely in tech fields, especially with really high salaries, right? Median salaries for open jobs, as a software engineer, $98,000. Man, it took me a long time to make $98,000. Okay, what do young people want from work, right? And sorry, I think I flipped these. On this slide, it's millennials on one side and Gen Z it's the other. Okay, so what do they care about? What is their kind of work orientation? So both care about work environment, right? Millennials and Gen Z both cared about work environment, but this one I think is really interesting because it's considerably higher for Gen Z than it is for millennials, which I think is interesting, right? So flexible hours, and you can hear that, flexible schedule, work from home. And it's actually really funny because a couple of years ago, the CCR the CCR and the partnership grant, the Center for Criminological Research, were hiring a study coordinator for the big research project that's going on there. And we interviewed like 5 people, and I got to sit in on those interviews. And inevitably, the first question, you get to the end of the interview, and you're like, hey, do you have any questions for us? And every single candidate, and they were all Gen Z, was, can I work from home, right? How many days a week would I be able to work from home, right? And how much flexibility is there in this job? So Gen Z really values flexibility. Good pay is important, right? Although millennials want great benefits. Great people, flexible schedule, all of these things, right? But for Gen Z, flexible hours, flexible schedule are really, really, really important. So there is a kind of orientation towards fitting, sorry, I just saw easy work, fitting work into your life in a way that works for you. I love easy work, right? That it's like somewhere over 1% of them want a really, really easy job. And a little bit more than that want a job that has free food, which I think is also, you know what? I'm down with that. I like it. One of the big perks of being on campus is sometimes there's events where I can then go steal like 5 free sandwiches and, there's my lunch for the week. So I can vibe with this free food thing Gen Z's got going. But I think, right, work environment, important for both, and flexibility. I know I've made a mess of this slide. Really important for Gen Z. I want to make sure I get you out on time, which is why I keep checking my watch. Okay, I got 2 minutes left. All right, things that they don't want. And I'm sorry, I flipped these now. So Gen Z is on this side. Gen Z really does not want to work long hours or low pay, which is fair, right? And probably, speaks to where they are in their life when this Glassdoor survey, this is 2021, when this data was gathered. They don't want to work minimum wage, rude customers. No one wants rude customers, friends. And poor management, all those things. 1% of them don't want hard work either. So that's fun. Millennials, right, slightly different orientation. They don't want long hours either. They don't want to have to deal with upper management in equal proportion to not wanting long hours and much more than low pay. This one is kind of a unique one for millennials, and this is a term that millennials pioneered, is life balance, right? And here I'm assuming they don't want a poor life balance, right? So what's important to them? Flexibility, good pay. They don't want long hours and low pay, which makes sense. AKA Nepo babies. Okay. Oh, all right. How are we doing for time? Do I have time for one more? All right. I'm going to push it to the last minute. So, millennials versus Gen Z in the workplace. This is kind of an interesting dynamic too, because increasingly millennials are going to be Gen Z's bosses. So that's fun. Okay. Gen Z, motivated by money and job security, which makes sense. Here, and I want to stress, there's an anxious component to this, right? A need for frequent feedback on their performance. One of the things we see in terms of the kind of qualities of Gen Z is a lot of anxiety. And so a lot of feedback on their performance, is really important. They want to hear that they're doing a good job, driven by individual performance and competition, and they prioritize, healthy work-life balance. Compared to millennials, right? They want purpose, more interested in ongoing conversations than annual assessments. I hate annual assessments. So I can absolutely say annual assessments are terrible. Interested in collaboration and teamwork, and view their career as the most important thing in their lives. Man, millennials used to be cool. We totally sold out. But yeah, kind of. All right. Let's stop. Okay, now it's 3:50. I can legitimately say I've used every feasible moment. So let's stop here. We'll finish up work on Wednesday. We'll talk probably sex and intimacy, which is another reasonably short unit. And then we'll build towards our second midterm. All right, we will see you Wednesday, where I will most likely maybe have your midterms marked, probably, if I get to it, perhaps.